The sky turned black like midnight at 1:15 p.m. Not dark, black. Then came the sound, not thunder, not wind, but a deep, tearing roar that felt like the earth splitting open from below. It started in the hills near Ellington, Missouri, on March 18, 1925. A funnel touched ground, and what followed was not just a tornado. It was a sentient apocalypse, a moving execution, a thing that seemed to think and choose. 352 kilometers, 3 states, 3 hours and 35 minutes, 695 dead. The tri-state tornado remains the deadliest tornado in United States history. The air that morning had felt wrong. Warm, too warm for mid-March, gusty, pressure building like something breathing against the skin. Families woke, dressed, sent children to school. Farmers checked livestock, shop owners opened doors. The weather forecast had been normal. There was no warning. There could not be. The word tornado had been banned from U.S. weather forecasts since the late 19th century to prevent public panic. No one was allowed to say what was coming. No one knew. Just heat, just wind, just the feeling that the sky was holding its breath. By noon, the atmosphere had thickened. Some noticed the stillness. Birds stopped singing. Cattle moved toward barns without being called. A few looked west and saw clouds stacking, bruised and low, like fists forming. Cold air advection along a cold front collided with moist, warm air. A textbook set up for severe thunderstorms, but no textbook could prepare anyone for what materialized next. The conditions were perfect, deadly perfect, the kind that births monsters. Modern reanalysis reveals that the tri-state tornado was spawned by a long-lived supercell thunderstorm that developed very near the center of a cyclone. As the supercell and dry line moved rapidly eastward, the northward advance of the warm front kept the tornadic supercell within an extremely favorable storm environment for several hours. This consistent time and space connection of the supercell, warm front, and dry line was extraordinarily unusual, a perfect alignment of atmospheric chaos. The storm began as a classic supercell, with the heaviest precipitation to the north of the tornado. But once it entered southern Illinois, it transitioned into a high precipitation supercell, with heavy rain and hail nearly wrapping around the tornado, largely obscuring it from view, similar to other deadly tornadoes like the 2011 EF5 Joplin, Missouri tornado. At 1:01 p.m., the funnel touched down near Ellington, Missouri. A farmer saw it first, a gray-black column dropping from the clouds, wide as a field, roaring like a freight train made of screaming metal. It moved northeast, fast, 62 miles per hour forward speed, faster than most cars on the roads at the time. It did not waver, did not lift, did not stop. It simply ate the earth in front of it, chewing through farms, forests, towns. Annapolis, Missouri, population 300, was the first to die. 90% of the town vanished in less than 2 minutes. Homes exploded, roofs peeled off and tumbled through the air like playing cards. Walls collapsed inward, then outward, then disintegrated. 2 people died instantly. Others were buried under timber, brick, glass, mud. Survivors crawled out bleeding, deaf from the roar, staring at a landscape that no longer resembled home. Trees had been stripped bare, animals were gone, the sky was brown with dust and debris, and the tornado moved on. Beale, Missouri. Destroyed, completely. 4 dead. The town had been there for 50 years. In 90 seconds, it became a memory, a smear of wood and stones scattered across the fields. A church bell was found 3 miles away. A baby's crib landed in a tree, intact, empty. The tornado did not discriminate. It took everything. Near Sedgwickville, the tornado began to scour the ground, digging into the soil, ripping up roots, peeling away the very surface of the earth. Debris from this area was found almost 50 miles away, carried on winds exceeding 350 kilometers per hour. Witnesses later described seeing entire houses lifted whole, spun in the air, then dropped and shattered. Livestock flew, wagons tumbled. A man was picked up, carried 200 yards, and deposited in a ditch, alive but broken. His wife was never found. The wind carried everything. Photograph albums opened mid-flight. Pages fluttering like dying birds. Letters written decades ago, stored in attic trunks, scattered across 3 states, landing in fields where strangers would find them years later, and wonder about the lives described in faded ink. A child's doll was found 30 miles from where the house had stood, its porcelain face cracked, but still smiling, lying in a ditch filled with rainwater and blood. The tornado did not just destroy, it redistributed, scattered, erased context, made the familiar grotesque. The tornado crossed into Illinois at 2:26 p.m. It hit Gorham first. The town had 500 residents. Half were killed or injured. Every building was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Survivors described a moment of absolute silence before the storm hit, as if the world had been muted, then the roar, then darkness, then nothing. A woman clung to her children in a cellar as the house above her was ripped away. She could hear the nails pulling from the wood. She could hear the walls screaming. When she emerged, the street was gone, the houses were gone, the sky was red with fire and dust. One survivor described the sensation of the air pressure dropping so suddenly that her ears popped and she tasted metal on her tongue. Another said the wind sounded like 1,000 screaming voices, all begging at once, all ignored. A man who had been thrown 200 feet through the air said he remembered flying, remembered seeing his house below him, remembered thinking this must be what death feels like. Weightless, inevitable, strangely calm. Murfreesboro, Illinois. Population 11,000. The tornado entered the northern part of town at 2:34 p.m. In 4 minutes, 234 people were dead. It remains the highest death toll from a tornado in a single community in U.S. history. The Logan School, a 3-story brick building, was struck directly. The top floor was ripped away. Students waiting inside for the school bus were crushed under tons of debris. At least 9 children died in the school. Othella Sylvie, 11 years old, climbed out from the wreckage and looked toward her home. Less than 2 blocks away, she saw nothing, just flattened wasteland. She could not tell which direction was home. The force of the wind was incomprehensible. A wooden board, 4 feet long by 8 inches wide, was driven so deeply into the trunk of a maple tree near the Logan School that it could hold the weight of a grown man. The board is still on display today, a silent witness to the physics of annihilation. Wind speeds over 200 miles per hour, enough to turn air into a blade, to make splinters into bullets. Inside the school, time fractured. One moment children sat in rows, waiting for dismissal, whispering to each other, planning games for after school. The next moment, the ceiling peeled back like skin from a wound, and the walls folded inward, and desks became missiles, and the air filled with glass and brick and the screams of children who understood in that final second that they were dying. Teachers threw themselves over students, trying to shield them with their bodies, but the wind did not care about bravery or sacrifice. It simply crushed everything equally, indifferently, thoroughly. Fires broke out almost immediately. Gas lines ruptured. Wooden debris ignited. By nightfall, much of Murfreesboro was burning. There was no water. The water mains had been destroyed. Firefighters stood and watched as entire blocks went up in flames. The injured were pulled from rubble and laid in the streets. There were too many. Doctors worked by firelight, sewing wounds, amputating limbs, deciding who could be saved and who could not. Bodies were stacked in the high school. The dead outnumbered the living in some neighborhoods. Everything was on fire, it seemed, one survivor wrote. There was no light except the flare of flames. We were black from head to foot. The skin of both living and dead who were exposed to the force of the wind was black from dirt and sand driven into it. People walked the streets without clothes, wrapped in rugs or blankets, their shoes blown off, their faces unrecognizable. Children searched for parents. Parents screamed for children. The confusion was maddening, primal. Dynamite was used to create fire breaks, blowing up buildings to stop the fire from spreading. The roar of explosions mixed with the crackle of flames and the moans of the injured. By dawn, 1/3 of Murfreesboro had been erased. Thousands were homeless. The morgue overflowed. Bodies were buried in mass graves because there was no other choice. The morgue ran out of space within hours. Bodies were laid in rows in the courthouse basement, in the high school gymnasium, in any building still standing. Families walked through the rows, lifting sheets, searching for familiar faces among the dead. Many bodies were unrecognizable, burned, crushed, stripped of clothing and identifying features by the wind. Some were never identified at all, buried under headstones that read only, "Unknown, March 18, 1925. Children who survived the school collapses were often silent for days afterward, unable or unwilling to speak about what they had seen. One girl, when asked about the storm, simply said, "The sky opened up and ate us." Another child refused to enter any building with more than one story for the rest of his life, sleeping outside even in winter, saying he would rather freeze than be trapped again. You're inside this moment now. Stay with us. What happens next? Rewrote the rules of disaster response. But the tornado did not stop. It moved on, relentless, mechanical, godless. DeSoto, Illinois. Population 600. The tornado hit at 2:45 p.m. 33 children died when the school collapsed. 3 girls, Tina Mae Barnett, Ruth Taylor, and Nellie Bell, sought refuge in the school's outdoor toilet. The building was blown across the railroad tracks. Their bodies were found 2 days later, trapped under the wreckage. One mother later said, "It's worrisome to think that maybe they weren't killed. Maybe they starved to death." The horror of not knowing. The horror of knowing. Ruth Maroney, 6 years old at the time, remembered being picked up by her brother moments before the tornado hit. Her father was struck in the head. Her sister Elsie was bleeding. The tornado threw her mother, Minnie, against a tree. Ruth suffered only 3 small scratches. Their house was flattened. After the tornado was over, nobody knew where anybody was, she said decades later. You could be blown forever. The schools were death traps. Built solidly of brick and timber, they seemed safe, permanent, indestructible. But the tornado did not care about construction quality. It simply lifted roofs, collapsed walls, turned sanctuaries of learning into mass graves. Parents who had sent their children to school that morning, believing they were protecting them from bad weather, returned to find only rubble and small shoes scattered among the bricks. West Frankfort, Illinois, nearly 150 dead. Parrish, Illinois, 148 dead, over 500 homes destroyed. The tornado carved through the heart of southern Illinois like a knife through flesh, leaving a path of destruction almost 1 mile wide. Entire communities were erased in seconds. Forests were flattened. The land looked like it had been bombed from the air. At Lick Creek, a rural community centered around a small church, the tornado passed in less than a minute. Every house for a mile was annihilated. Levi Hook had moved his family away just months before. The day after the storm, he returned to survey the damage. His son Eli had been in school 8 miles away and saw something strange falling from the sky during the storm, a piece of a sewing machine. The entire route home was strewn with debris. When Levi reached the hill overlooking Lick Creek, he said, everything he could see below the hill in the Lick Creek area looked flat. Nothing was standing. The landscape itself had been fundamentally altered. Creeks changed course where debris dammed the flow. Hills were stripped of topsoil, exposing bedrock that had not seen sunlight in millennia. Forests that had stood for centuries were reduced to fields of splinters. Every tree snapped at ground level or ripped from the earth entirely. Root systems exposed like the organs of a dissected animal. One farmer returned to his property to find his barn had been moved 300 feet from its foundation and set down intact, still upright, as if carefully relocated by invisible hands. Inside, his horse stood unharmed, still tied to its post, surrounded by hay bales that had not shifted an inch, but the farmhouse was gone, completely, utterly erased. Not a single board remaining to mark where it had stood. The tornado crossed the Wabash River into Indiana at 4:08 p.m. It hit Griffin first. The town of Griffin, Indiana, lay in ruins within minutes. At least 50 people were killed, many of them school children. The tornado smashed the school building, ripping away the upper rear rooms. Students waiting for the school bus were trapped under tons of debris, their screams filling the air. The bus itself had just stopped near a home to let children out when the tornado struck. It was blown into a nearby field, killing the driver and several children inside. The day had broken hot and sultry. By late afternoon, the gusty March wind had turned into a howling funnel that roared out of the west and obliterated Griffin. The dead and dying were everywhere. Survivors climbed out from mountains of broken timber, bleeding, deaf, searching for family members who would never be found. The school bus driver, a man named Thomas, had been driving the route for 15 years without incident. His wife had packed him a lunch that morning, kissed him goodbye, told him to be safe on the roads. When rescuers found the bus, it had been wrapped around a tree, metal twisted like paper, windows blown out, seats ripped from their bolts. Thomas was still at the wheel, his hands locked in a death grip on the steering mechanism, his eyes open, staring at something no one else could see. The tornado moved on, through farms, through homes, through lives. Owensville, Princeton, 85 farms destroyed, 45 more dead in Princeton alone. The funnel finally dissipated around 4:30 p.m., approximately 3 miles southwest of Petersburg, Indiana. 3 hours and 35 minutes, 219 miles, 695 dead, over 2,000 injured. Entire towns wiped from the map. Scientists studying the event decades later discovered 2,395 individual damage points along the path. Even with this extensive field work, there were 32 gaps of at least 1 mile in length and 7 gaps longer than 2.5 miles. All of the longer gaps were in the Missouri portion of the path, within the sparsely populated Ozark Mountain area. Assuming that gaps shorter than 2.5 miles might still represent a continuous tornado, the continuous path was at least 174 miles long. The research also revealed previously unreported tornadoes before the beginning and after the end of the tri-state tornado. The supercell also produced accompanying hail up to baseball size and non-tornadic damaging winds. The question that haunted meteorologists for decades was whether the tri-state tornado was actually one tornado or a family of tornadoes. Modern weather records suggest that a tornado with a track as long as the tri-state typically results from a cyclical supercell rather than one massive storm. In this process, the storm continuously evolves, and the decay of one supercell leads to the development of another. Each supercell may be responsible for parenting one or more tornadoes. Without close examination of the storm and its damage path, it can appear to the observer that the damage resulted from one tornado, when in reality a family of tornadoes generated by a cyclical supercell caused the destruction. But to those on the ground, the distinction was meaningless. Whether it was one tornado or 10, the result was the same: total annihilation. The aftermath was biblical. Rescue workers arrived to find landscapes that defied comprehension. Where towns had stood, there was only rubble. Where forests had grown, there were splinters. Bodies were found miles from where they had been standing when the storm hit. Some were never found at all. Families were erased, mothers, fathers, children, all gone in the same moment. Neighboring communities provided food, temporary housing, medicine. Survivors demonstrated resilience, but the grief was unbearable, untenable. Rescue efforts began immediately but were chaotic, uncoordinated, overwhelmed. There was no Federal Emergency Management Agency in 1925, no National Guard mobilization protocols, no disaster response infrastructure. Local doctors and volunteers simply started digging, pulling bodies and survivors from the wreckage with their bare hands. Neighboring towns sent wagons loaded with food, blankets, medical supplies, but the roads were blocked by debris, making travel nearly impossible. The American Red Cross mobilized within hours, but even they were unprepared for the scale of the disaster. More than 550 Red Cross workers eventually arrived in the affected areas, providing shelter, meals, and relief supplies. They opened emergency shelters, distributed food and water, and helped coordinate the identification and burial of the dead. But the needs were overwhelming. Thousands homeless, hospitals overflowing, entire communities without food, water, or shelter. Medical teams worked around the clock, but they were facing injuries unlike anything they had trained for. Massive trauma, compound fractures, deep lacerations, burns from the fires that followed the tornado. Anesthesia ran out, morphine ran out, bandages ran out. Doctors began performing amputations without anesthetic, holding patients down while they screamed because the alternative was death from gangrene. Fires burned for days. The smell of death hung over southern Illinois and Indiana for weeks. Morgues overflowed, hospitals ran out of beds, then out of floor space, then out of rooms entirely. The injured were stacked in basements, in hallways, in any space that could hold a body. Doctors worked until they collapsed. Volunteers dug through rubble with bare hands until their fingers bled. Mass graves were dug on the outskirts of affected towns. Bodies were wrapped in sheets, or in nothing because there were not enough sheets, and buried in long trenches, dozens at a time. Priests and ministers stood at the gravesides and spoke blessings over the dead, but the words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of such overwhelming loss. Some families never learned where their loved ones were buried, the records lost or never kept in the chaos of those first terrible days. Tower Grove Cemetery in Murfreesboro became a focal point of grief. Families who could afford individual graves buried their dead there, marking the plots with simple stones that bore names and a single date, March 18, 1925. For decades afterward, survivors would walk through the cemetery on the anniversary of the tornado, placing flowers on graves, speaking to the dead, keeping the memory alive. If stories like this matter, subscribe, keep history alive. The psychological toll was immense and largely unaddressed. In 1925, there was no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder, no grief counseling, no mental health support for disaster survivors. People simply endured. They rebuilt. They moved on, or tried to, but the nightmares never stopped. The fear never fully subsided. Children who survived often suffered the most. They had watched classmates die, seen their homes destroyed, lost parents and siblings in moments of unimaginable violence. Many became silent, withdrawn, unable to articulate the trauma they had experienced. Others became hypervigilant, flinching at every dark cloud, every gust of wind, unable to trust the sky again. One survivor interviewed decades later said she still could not sleep when storms approached. She would sit in a chair by the window, fully dressed, shoes on, watching the sky, waiting for the roar. "You never forget that sound," she said. "It gets into your bones. It stays there." The tri-state tornado was not just a weather event. It was a rupture in reality, a moment when nature revealed its capacity for absolute, indifferent destruction. The tornado did not discriminate. It killed rich and poor, young and old, guilty and innocent. It destroyed churches and schools and homes with equal disregard. It was a mile-wide funnel of wind exceeding 200 miles per hour, moving at 62 miles per hour across 3 states, never stopping, never slowing, never showing mercy. The economic devastation was staggering. In 1925 dollars, the damage exceeded 18 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Entire business districts were wiped out. Farms that had been in families for generations were reduced to barren fields of debris. Insurance companies went bankrupt trying to cover the losses. Many survivors received no compensation at all, left to rebuild with nothing but their hands and whatever materials they could salvage from the wreckage. The tornado changed meteorology forever. It forced scientists to confront the reality that tornadoes were not rare anomalies but predictable, recurring threats. It led to the eventual lifting of the ban on the word tornado in weather forecasts. It showed that preparedness, warning systems, and public education could save lives, but only if people were allowed to know the truth. The tri-state tornado was rated F5 under the Fujita scale. the highest rating, indicating winds over 260 miles per hour and catastrophic damage. Entire towns were not damaged, they were erased. Foundations were swept clean, trees were debarked and snapped at ground level. The earth itself was scoured, stripped of topsoil, left raw and bleeding. This was not wind, this was annihilation. The physical evidence of the tornado's power was almost incomprehensible. A cast iron stove, weighing over 300 pounds, was found half a mile from the nearest house, embedded 3 feet deep in the ground. A photograph album belonging to a family in Missouri was found intact in a field in Indiana, over 100 miles away. A piece of straw had been driven through a telephone pole with such force that it could not be pulled out. It had to be cut out with a saw. 100 years later, the scars remain. Descendants of survivors still tell the stories. Historians trace the path, searching for physical evidence, depressions in the land, old foundations, trees that grew crooked because they were saplings when the wind bent them. Museums display artifacts. The wooden board driven into the maple tree, photographs of flattened towns, lists of the dead. The names are long, the faces are young, the loss is immeasurable. Virtual cemeteries have been created online, cataloging the victims, preserving their names and stories for future generations. Family historians have spent decades researching the tornado, tracking down survivors, recording their testimonies, ensuring that what happened on March 18, 1925 is never forgotten. The tri-state tornado was not the only tornado that day. At least 7 other twisters spun off from the same storm system, tearing through Kentucky and Alabama. In total, the outbreak killed over 800 people and injured more than 2,000. It remains the deadliest tornado outbreak in U.S. history. But the tri-state tornado was the crown jewel of that horror. The longest, the widest, the fastest, the deadliest. The wind unzipped 3 states. It opened the earth and showed what lay beneath. Fragility, mortality, the thin veneer of civilization that can be stripped away in seconds. People lived their lives believing in walls, in roofs, in the solidity of the ground beneath their feet. The tornado taught them otherwise. It taught them that everything is temporary. Everything can be taken. Everything can vanish. The sound was the worst part, survivors said, not the destruction, not the death. The sound. A roar so deep and loud it felt like the universe was tearing in half. A sound that erased all other sounds, voices, prayers, screams, until there was only the roar, and then silence, and then the moaning of the injured and the crackle of fire. Years later, meteorologists and disaster response experts would study the tri-state tornado as a case study in catastrophic failure. Failure of warning systems, failure of building codes, failure of emergency response infrastructure. They would use it to justify the development of tornado warning systems, the construction of storm shelters, the implementation of building codes designed to withstand extreme winds. Every advance in tornado safety can be traced back, in some way, to the lessons learned on March 18, 1925. But no amount of preparation can fully protect against a tornado of that magnitude. The tri-state tornado was an outlier, an extreme event, a perfect storm of atmospheric conditions that aligned to create something truly monstrous. Modern building codes might reduce casualties. Early warning systems might save lives. But if the same conditions aligned today, if a mile-wide F5 tornado traveled for over 200 miles across densely populated areas, the death toll could be even higher. The tri-state tornado ended 100 years ago, but its echo never stopped. It reverberates through every weather warning, every storm shelter, every moment when the sky turns green and the air goes still. It is a reminder that nature does not negotiate. It does not care. It simply moves, and we are in the way. In the years following the tornado, the affected communities slowly rebuilt. New homes rose from the rubble. New schools opened. New businesses began. But the towns were never quite the same. The populations had been decimated, the survivors traumatized, the economic base shattered. Some families left, unable to stay in places that held such terrible memories. Others stayed, determined to honor the dead by continuing to live, to build, to remember. Memorials were erected, simple stone markers, plaques, monuments bearing the names of the dead. Schools held annual remembrance ceremonies. Churches preached sermons about survival and faith and the incomprehensible nature of God's will. The tornado became part of the local identity, a shared trauma that bound communities together, even as it tore them apart. The meteorological community spent decades analyzing the storm, trying to understand how such a catastrophic event could occur. The reanalysis conducted nearly 70 years after the tornado revealed the extraordinary nature of the atmospheric conditions that day. The alignment of the warm front, the dry line, and the supercell, creating a perfect environment for a long-lived, violent tornado. But even with modern understanding, even with advanced forecasting technology, tornadoes of this magnitude remain unpredictable, uncontrollable, unstoppable. 695 people died in 3 hours. They died in schools, in homes, in streets, in fields. They died quickly or slowly, alone or together, knowing or unknowing. They died because the sky decided it was time. And when it was over, the survivors stood in the ruins and asked why. But the wind had already moved on. It left no answer. Only ashes, only memory, only the long, unbroken silence of the dead. The legacy of the tri-state tornado is written in the survival strategies we use today, the basements we build, the warnings we heed, the drills we practice. It is written in the faces of descendants who carry the stories of grandparents who survived, who lost everything, who rebuilt from nothing. It is written in the landscape itself, the odd gaps in forest growth where trees never returned, the depressions in fields where homes once stood, the slight shifts in creek paths where debris altered the flow. The tri-state tornado was a teacher, and the lesson was brutal. Nature is not your friend, not your enemy, simply indifferent. It will take your home, your family, your life without malice, without purpose, without meaning. The only response is to prepare, to remember, to respect the power that lurks in every dark cloud, every shift in wind direction, every moment when the air grows too still and the sky turns the wrong color. If this story moved you, subscribe and keep its echo alive. The blast ended in seconds, but its echo rewrote time. The names of the dead are carved in stone. The stories of survivors are passed down through generations. The meteorological data is analyzed and reanalyzed, each study revealing new insights into the nature of extreme weather events. The tri-state tornado of 1925 remains the deadliest in U.S. history, a record no one hopes will ever be broken. 100 years later, on anniversaries of the tornado, descendants gather at cemeteries and memorial sites. They place flowers. They speak names. They tell stories passed down through families, stories of survival, of loss, of the day. The sky turned black and the wind tore through 3 states, leaving nothing but memory and silence in its wake. The tornado may have ended, but the reckoning never stopped. The echo continues. The dead are remembered. The wind somewhere is still howling.